As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. Once again, I am super excited to be speaking to one of my favorite people about one of my favorite people. So today, joining me, we have none other than Quincy Diallo to speak about James Baldwin. How are you, my brother?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thank you for having me on. Thanks for the kind words.
Absolute pleasure. This episode has been one in the making for quite some time. Quincy is very hard to get a hold of. So finally, he has decided to grace us with his presence on the Malcolm Effect. It's an honor for us and all our listeners. So, speaking about all things James Baldwin, someone whose literary output remains an enduring muse for my own scholarship, and I could only hope to be a fraction of the literary genius he is. As someone who also has taken an interest in James Baldwin for quite some time, from far longer than I have, I guess for our listeners, what was your first exposure to James Baldwin and what was your reaction?
Yeah, so I think that my first exposure to Baldwin, there was a film about him called I'm Not Your Negro. I don't remember what year that came out, but my mom went to go see an advanced screening of it, and I was really jealous just because I'd heard the name over and over again. And I realized sort of then that like I was kind of a fucking like poser and that I hadn't actually exposed myself to his work the way that I was supposed to.
Hmm.
So I sort of just tried to dive in from there, and then it really hardened and I became more steadfast in my reading of his work and more dedicated to writing about his work and stuff as I approached college. So like 4 or 5 years ago, I really like dove in, I would say, but I've been exposed for longer than that.
Okay, so immediately once you start to begin to dive in to James Baldwin, what are some of the things you immediately notice, or what are some of the things that immediately capture you and get your attention?
I think that he was very patient and forgiving of, you know, who he would call, who he would refer to as his countrymen,
Hmm.
white Americans, and all of that in a way that was really, really interesting to me at that time, just because I was a jaded kid, angsty
Hmm.
teenager, and was just like, couldn't get on that page really until I read his work and sort of came to at least try to understand white people through his eyes. And it really
Hmm.
calmed me down, gave me a level of hope and peace that I valued. And then really his perspective on like love, if nothing else, both as a in the interpersonal sense and the religious sense, in most importantly to me, the political sense, really just busted my world wide open and changed how I approached everything in life, really.
I'm loving that. I'm loving that. James Baldwin as praxis. You've opened up a new dimension or another dimension actually to look into and how we engage figures. Oftentimes I find that when we speak of black literary heroes, we often have hagiographical accounts of them, deservedly so, in which we praise them, in which we extol their many virtues. But oftentimes one thing I like to bring people back to is we're trying to engage such figures as great as they are, but as people or theory. And theory does not have to be the old dead Russian niggers, as one meme and tweet said. Theory comes in many other forms. And one of the things I like about James Baldwin, as you just brilliantly put out, is how we engage him as a person, as a person of theory. So I guess for those who may not be as aware as James Baldwin, And again, this won't do it justice, and I encourage people to read more. But briefly, let's speak about his life. What are some of the key moments you think we should highlight when speaking about James Baldwin's biography?
I think that you can't read any of his work, watch any of his videos without the context of the Harlem that he grew up in. Like,
Hmm.
I think that that is, if not the most important thing about sort of the formation of his identity and really just the pardon me, the like way that he built his life and everything and the way that he reacted to the world and the way that he, became sort of highly critical and theoretical in the not necessarily super quote unquote academic sense, or not in the old Russian nigga kind of sense, is his upbringing in Harlem. I think his upbringing in the church, very important. His queerness, very important. And his time as an expat is sort of vital to understanding him, as well as his, and finally, his close relationship with key civil rights figures in a way that I think a lot of times, because of his impulse to understand and even at times forgive his countrymen, gets obscured,
Hmm.
like his relationship with, the namesake of this podcast. Malcolm X was absolutely, as he described it, there was an esteem between them that could only be really described as a love. I'm paraphrasing, but that's from No Name in the Street, my
Hmm.
favorite Baldwin essay. And yeah, I think that it's sort of important to consider
Oh, can you hear me?
those. Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, I think you stopped talking. It's fine. Thank you so much for that. In terms of, we've spoken about the myriad ways in which Baldwin viewed love, from the political, spiritual, interpersonal. So I guess let's unpack those further and let's speak to those three registers: the political, the spiritual, and the interpersonal. How do you think Baldwin understood and would have explained love on those three registers? Let's take it one by one.
Yeah, so I'll start with the spiritual. I think that that was really informed by his upbringing and eventual departure from the black church that he grew up in and the very religious, pious family, son of a preacher type of family that he came from. In that, you're taught in environments like that to love God first and really love and serve God above all else.
Hmm.
And I think that his departure, which was in part, of course, motivated by his queerness, was that was a desire, a deep desire to be worldly, a deep desire to fall in love with, the world and to learn how to love himself in a country, in a family, in a church, et cetera, which rejected him. So I think that loving the self for him, or at least coming to terms with who he was, really was an act for him of a spiritual kind of love. And all of the three of them sort of work together. But I would say, yeah, the spiritual love is very pious in a sense, or very like very much informed by the Christian idea of, Christian ideals of loving thy neighbor, and ultimately just a question of respect. And on the interpersonal, I think that
Before you
a
carry on the
lot of
interpersonal, let's just go deeper into the religious then and spiritual, given that it's somewhat so heavily informed by his upbringing, his Christian upbringing, but also he's having to navigate his queerness, his sexuality with what's happening in the church. How did he navigate this? Like, where does it come out, or how does it come out? How does he deal with these tensions?
I think that you can really trace it back to, or the way I sort of see it is his semi autobiographical first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, which he said he had to write if he was ever going to write anything else. And the conflation of his queerness with sin, the character John, who's coming of age, who's based on Baldwin himself, the first time that he masturbates in the book, it's to these fantasies about the older boys in his school. And,
Mm-hmm.
there's a scene which I can't even begin to capture the eloquence of the language and description, where he wrestles with an older boy that he seems to have a crush on, literally in the church. And the imagery, the words that Paulton used to describe it, are very sexually charged. And the idea of the this great sin, this, you know, unpious lust in the house of God, is sort of what informed that spiritual love, and that for him, he was willing to, even though he pushed back on often and questioned his religion, he was willing to forsake, eternity, the kingdom of heaven, to experience the worldly present kind of love. And I think that that's sort of where I think of on the spiritual level. That's what that means and how it interacted with his religion. It wasn't necessarily that they were one and the same and that he loved God the way that he was quote unquote supposed to, but it was in his defiance where that spiritual sort of love arose.
That was beautifully explained. Thank you very much for that. And I'm glad I cut you off to go in deeper because I was like snapping my fingers whilst hearing to your response. So, speaking about the next two, then the political and interpersonal, what was Baldwin's engagement with these questions through his works, and how did he explain them and understand them?
Yeah, to add to your original question first, I think that one of the other things that I really love about Baldwin, and that was really important to me coming to his work at the age that I did, was his description of love first as the way that parents treat their children and the way that children react to their parents. He writes coming of age in a way that nobody else that I've read really has. And I think on the interpersonal level, a lot of times for Baldwin, love meant a kind of protection, whether that was a protection from the harshness of, the life of pre civil rights movement Harlem and pre gentrification Harlem and all of that, or it was a protection from, white terror, or whether it was protection from even his abusive father, right? Like as carried out by his mother, his grandmother, and, eventually in whatever romantic relationships or friendships that he has, like love is in many ways about protection. And what precedes the interpersonal love almost always in Baldwin's texts is this idea of knowing, this idea of intimacy, like knowing someone when they're naked. That appears
Hmm.
often and over in his work. Naked in not just the physical sense, obviously, but the emotional sense, the vulnerability of a newborn child, or the emotional intimacy between lovers. That sort of idea that someone can know you, accept you, and protect you from the harshness of the world, protect your nakedness from those who wish to do you harm or those who wish to exploit it, is really foundational, in my opinion, to how Baldwin sort of discusses that interpersonal love and approaches interpersonal love. That idea of protection and acceptance, knowing, taking the effort to know to truly know somebody, to know unassailable and like concealed truths about that person, is requirement, a prerequisite for loving them.
Once again, thank you so much for that beautiful response. And then I know these are somewhat all intertwined, but let's speak more about the political. So, this
Yeah.
act of love as mediated through the political, how did James Baldwin understand this and how did he write about this?
Yeah. So I think that clip has been clip of him discussing love,
With Giovanni,
albeit even
Nikki
briefly,
Giovanni.
I believe so, has been circulated like more widely, but the love has never been a popular movement. Uh,
Oh, yes, that one. Okay,
that
yes.
quote. Yeah, yeah, yeah. that's the one that I think is very telling about his conceptualization of love as political, right? Like the even to describe love, this sort of ambiguous and ill-defined concept as a movement. You know, movements
Hmm.
require action, and I think that that's what ties together loving for Baldwin as the spiritual, political, and interpersonal is that there is some kind of an act, some kind of a dedication to carrying out and leading with love in a way that you know is going to be challenged. And so I think that that's where my sort of idea of love as a political comes from, in
Hmm.
that there's a level of resistance required to be a lover in the world. You know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
think that that's just there's no question about resistance being inherently political, right? So I think
Yeah.
when that's your sort of conceptualization of it, like it's you have no choice but to think of love as political. And you know, he writes it not just in describing the interpersonal reactions to, you know, the civil rights leaders or the Algerians in France or,
Hmm.
you know, the saints and sinners that he grew up surrounded by in Harlem. But I totally lost my train of thought. Anyway, sort of conceptualizes love as a popular movement as the sum of its parts. You know what I mean? As like, yes, he had a deep and unflinching emotional, spiritual connection and interpersonal relationships with people like Malcolm X and Dr. King, but also that they shaped him, they changed him. And that's sort of where my idea of love as a political comes from, in
Hmm.
that he chose to reject the things that he sort of, you know, might have idolized as a kid. You know, he sort of chose to reject, especially as described in No Name in the Street, as the just he walked away from the table. You know what I mean? He walked away from American intellectualism and liberalism and chose love when he realized that power had robbed them of their humanity in such a
Hmm.
way where they weren't necessarily capable of loving their fellow man the way that he was, because they weren't capable of or did not care to know their fellow man. You know, they didn't care to know the blacks from Harlem who, you know, served them, who raised their children, who suffered and toiled for years and who fled the South. That wasn't important to them so much as retaining their power was. And I think that when it came down to it, and it's especially written about, like I said, in No Name in the Street more than anything else in the Love is Political, is that love, especially when it's born of a shared struggle, not necessarily just identity, but a commitment to a shared struggle, a commitment to resistance. That's the enemy of power, and especially the enemy of, you know, capitalist, colonialist, imperialist power. I think that's sort of just
Thank you.
some of
No,
it.
no, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that thorough explanation and explication of those three registers and Baldwin's engagement with them and how to read love mediated through the political, interpersonal, and spiritual. So then let's speak about Baldwin as a political theorist. And in doing so, we understand that Baldwin very much has so many critiques on the institutions in which Black people frequent. So, for example, the church being one institution amongst many. He also has that famous speech where he's like, I don't know what white people feel like, but I know I'm not in their unions. And, he speaks about like, this is the evidence, for example. And what you
Yeah.
find in that is that Baldwin offers a systemic critique of the institutions. So, I guess my question to you is then, how and why does Baldwin explore the interplay between systemic racism, the church, religion, and then contemporary Black attitudes regarding queerness, for example?
Yeah, great question. I appreciate it. I think that a lot of times the way that he writes about it, especially in the first, you know, the intro to Go Tell It on the Mountain is the dichotomy between the saints and the sinners, and really like
Mm-hmm.
he'll juxtapose descriptions of, the prostitutes and drug addicts and gangsters or whatever that frequented the streets of Harlem at night versus the saints who rose to go to church in on Sunday mornings, right? And I think that what he does over and over is challenge this idea of righteousness and in putting them right next to each other and then zooming out, right? Say you're like a white person from Manhattan the
Mm-hmm.
time, at the same time that Go Tell It on the Mountain is taken. It doesn't necessarily matter who's righteous or not. Like, what has that done for the so-called saints in Harlem, right? They claim that it's a way that he sort of just exposes, like, yeah, you claim that you're better than really these people who should be your comrades and compatriots, and you condemn them in a way that, if you really think about what the text says, humans don't have a right to do. That's only God's decision, right? It's God's decision to condemn who he condemns
Yeah.
and exonerate who he exonerates. And so that I think that it's, for Baldwin, a big part of his rejection of the Black church politically was that it was divisive and that it was sort of being used in the same way that, the first quote unquote Christians who arrived in America did. It was used for the purpose of establishing some kind of a superiority or hierarchy that I think he often felt was inextricable from the church in America, because, that was the first, it's the origins of the church in America is Indian genocide and enslavement of blacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that what he was saying a lot of times is that that legacy is carried on, and you'll see the his preacher father in Go Tell It on the Mountain, or I should say, John's preacher father, curse his children and beat his children, and you'll see the pastor of the church humiliate his nephew and other members of his congregation in the quote unquote name of the Lord. And I think that as a in the sort of, the burgeoning quote unquote civil rights movement
Mm-hmm.
was just divisive in a way that Baldwin really couldn't forgive by the time he left. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that. So what we're seeing that is Baldwin's critique of the system, the institutions in which Black people frequent are also the same systems and same institutions that perpetuate the oppression of several segments of the Black community or Black
Yeah.
communities. No, thank you for that. So that leads quite brilliantly onto my next question then. Given that Baldwin has this critique of institutions and in the way they are have a hand in the oppression of so many Black folk, Black communities, Black community. I know it's controversial as to whether we say Black community or Black communities. I guess the obvious question here is, does a Black community exist in Baldwin's archive?
I'm going to hesitantly say no. I'm just writing a paper about that. Just sort of started research for that like actually a week ago. And so I don't want to over commit to the no, but I'm going to say like cautiously no. I think that communities is like qualifier for it, in that there's no overarching all Black people in, we'll keep it pegged to the US for now, like all Black people in the US are in community with each other, right? It's that the Black community is split up among a whole bunch of different castes of people. There's Black community among the, so-called like intelligentsia. There's Black community most often in his work, and I guess a lot of times even in the quote unquote real worlds where we find it is in the church. In fact, like those are communities, but even, a church 2 blocks from another one, those people aren't necessarily going to be in community with each other. They're not going to be communicating with each other. They're not going to necessarily be, they're not going to claim them as their brothers and sisters. There's Black community in the among the Panthers, and other
Yeah.
resistance movements among the students, et cetera, et cetera. There's communities all over the place. And, there's even community among the dope dealers and the prostitutes, right?
Hmm.
There's communities all over the place. And while they have their oppression in common, that takes different forms and different shapes for all of them. So you can't even necessarily, I think that as he exposes that, there's an implicit agreement that you can't even say that there's a Black community created by suffering alone. Like that's not going to work. It's like a return to the idea of love as necessary and as, understanding and knowing as as a prerequisite for it, right? Like if the saints refuse to know or attempt to understand the sinners, how can they be in community with them?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that explanation. And I guess in closing, then, talk to me about some of the key texts or some of the texts that you have found to be the most memorable for you and why.
Yeah. Of his fictional work, I would say Go Tell It on the Mountain is very near and dear to my heart, just because I think that, as he said himself, he needed to write this to understand him. And I think that for readers, that's no different. Really, if you want to understand Baldwin, understand his motivations, where he comes from, how he came to be, then Go Tell It on the Mountain is essential. I think that though I have my issues with the way it's been presented since 2020 and the uprisings and riots and stuff after George Floyd was lynched, The Fire Next Time is an essential nonfiction work of his. And I would suggest, honestly, that one reads The Fire Next Time and then No Name in the Street right after, just because you can see what those years did to him politically, personally, et cetera, et cetera. You can see how he changed and how you see the evolution of his politic in a way that I think is very, very compelling. I've always been more partial to non-fiction than fiction,
Hmm.
for whatever reason. But if I had to give one more, I would say I really, really loved I loved If Beale Street Could Talk. I really, really loved Giovanni's Room. It's sort of a further
One of my
excavation into
favorites.
his own, yeah, further like excavation into his own queerness as an adult. Because I think Go Tell It on the Mountain really centers on, sort of him trying to even understand his queerness as a kid, in addition to his life as an
Brilliant.
ex.
And anything else you want to let the listeners know about this brilliant man that we haven't covered already?
Yeah, I would say, just to circle back to the the love thing, the theme of this conversation episode, whatever, like it's also really, really important to remember and important to keep an eye out for when you're reading him, like the dichotomy. Like he really is a exemplification of that thin line between love and hate. And I think that that's really essential to understanding how he writes about and what he really thought about, if not his generation or the generation after him, the generation before him, and how they came to hate white people, and his hopes for the next generation in that idea of, like he wrote in My Dungeon Shook Letter to My Nephew, which is 2 pages. Everyone listening should
Mhm.
literally like read it today, even if you've read it. It served as the preface for Fire Next Time, but a letter to his nephew where he says that his 15-year-old Black nephew has to accept white people, and like on the sort of on the eve, the historical eve of integration in the United States, that his nephew, the downtrodden, spit on black youth, poor black youth, has to love and accept white people for the same reasons that like we as black people might be inclined to hate them. You know, we have to accept and love them because their power and the hate that it's wrought for them has also rotted their minds and robbed them of their right to being human in a way that's just always gorgeously presented and extremely interesting to watch him negotiate that sort of love and hate, even when he discusses his own father and, you know, the pity he felt for his mother and all of that.
Thank you so much. This has been, I hope this serves as an introduction. Again, we can never do Baldwin justice in several hours, months, and years, actually. So this is just to hopefully serve as a brief introduction, get people's palate a bit wet so they can be intrigued and interested further. And I will leave Quincy's socials in the comments. Please get in contact with him and he can direct you further. Until next time, people, peace out. Thank you.